Let's talk from our Abuja studios now with Mr. Olabode Olaomi, who is an oil and gas expert. Mr. Olaomi, thank you for your time. Good morning. Welcome to the program.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
This war isn't about oil and gas, but oil and gas has become one of its defining themes because Russia is one of the world's, if not the world's biggest producer of several of the energy sources that we are all familiar with. And those who think they can end this invasion by cutting off Russia's revenues from there have been working hard towards that. How viable do you think it is that the Western alliance in particular can cut off, particularly in Europe, the reliance on oil and gas from Russia in the short term?
Thank you. I think first of all, and fundamentally, Russia is the biggest gas producer in the world. Not oil, but gas. Now, most of that gas is supplied to Europe, continental Europe. So basically, there's no country in Europe that does not significantly rely on its gas. In point of fact, the UK, Germany, and I think Austria had contributed in ensuring that they spent about $3 billion to build a pipeline which was to be commissioned just before the invasion started. Now, the significance of that is that a lot of infrastructure and funding had been made available to ensure that they benefit from the gas. So it is not something that is going to change overnight. However, it is what it is. There is a war situation. What the government, what the Western powers are trying to do is basically to emasculate Russia and bring it to its knees. It's not necessarily to disseminate Russia because there are a lot of other factors that are there. But the resistance from Russia has been unexpected, as well as the resistance from Ukraine. So basically, it's a war situation. People have more innate energy than the opposition think. And then we find ourselves in this situation of oil and gas, which to a neutral nation like Nigeria should be positive because it has ensured that we are having revenues from oil and even from gas that we did not plan for.
The other thing, of course, in this is that we have seen that, and that's before I come to what you said last, which is how Nigeria could fit into all of this. But before we come to that, the Russians have showed that there is a market for their oil and their gas, even outside of continental Europe. We have been discussing here over the last couple of weeks the fact that there seems to have been a pivot. Russia is selling far more to India, for example. India is buying more, although at a discount. China is buying more also. So one is wondering how viable, even in the medium and long term, the plan to cut it off, let me use your word, emasculate it, will be if it has other people who are ready to buy.
But that's the nature of economic sanctions. I mean, if you check the history of economic sanctions, even to much weaker and smaller nations like Iraq, Iran, and all that, they've not really been successful. I mean, it brings hardship. Don't let us get it wrong. It brings a lot of inconvenience. But in terms of achieving the original goals, it's not been. I mean, one of the original intents with the sanctions was that the current situation was being planned by Russia as far back as 2014, based on what analysts says, when Russia originally invaded the Donetsk region and the US put in sanctions there. And one of the things they did was to build a war chest of finances across the world, which was close to about $6 trillion, according to what they said. One of the surprises from the war was that the economic sanctions by the US, by the Europe, was quick and swift, to the extent that they blocked all Russian investment, such that funds which they could have used to placate the economy and stabilize it was blocked from them within a week of declaring the war. But what they did not plan on the counter was for China and India, the two biggest consumers of oil in the world, to now divert their attention to Russia. The implication of this is that when you do a balancing of it, Russia may not have lost much. And that can be seen in how they have treated the rest of Europe. One of the things they have insisted on is that they've insisted that anybody buying Russian gas needs to pay in rubles, which is a direct affront on the US dollar. And they have gone a step further by stopping the supply of gas to Finland because they refuse to pay in ruble. The implication of that is that if there isn't sufficient alternative, because 40% of the gas from Finland comes in from Russia, it means that people could die during the winter in Finland.
Let me ask you about something that I know that you're quite familiar with. What the biggest country in Europe, which is Germany, I mean in the Western Alliance, that is Germany. And Germany is also particularly reliant on Russia for its energy needs. In fact, it was one of the most reluctant members of the European Union to sign on to this oil embargo, which was being proposed. But I know that now there's a plan to, quote, move away from that over-dependence, shall we say. Do you think that others may be watching that carefully to see whether it succeeds, and if it does, then to move in the same direction?
Well, ultimately it will succeed, but you see, buying oil or buying gas is not like buying tomatoes. There are a lot of things that goes into it. So it's going to take years because you're going to first get a supplier, somebody that has sufficient quantity, which if for the purposes of example, you can say Nigeria. But you see, it's one thing that we have gas. It's another thing that you have sufficient gas that can be processed or that is already processed and that can be transported. So for example, if we were to replace Russia to Germany, that means the Trans-Saharan pipeline need to be built. It also means that we need to develop a couple of gas wells that will produce sufficient gas. Yes, we do have gas, but the gas that we have is not in the state that it's going to be used. So it's a case of like having rivers of water, but not available to drink. So there's water everywhere, but none for drinking. So we have the gas. We also need to build processing plants. After we have done the processing plants, we need to build the pipeline infrastructure. Those are things that already exist in the case of Russia. So for whoever they're going to use to replace that, they're going to get a nation that has sufficient gas. They're going to have the required infrastructure to do it. I mean, the US has gas. They have enough processed gas, but they do not have the infrastructure to transport it from the US to Europe. And that's why they are using LNG vessels, which are ships. And that can only do so much. So it's not like they're supplying one country. They're talking about continental Europe. And trust me, if they push this to winter, the discussions are going to change drastically.
Let's bring in Nigeria, shall we? Because you referenced Nigeria a little bit there. And I mean, nobody will want to publicly admit that you benefit or you profit from a situation of suffering of others. But I mean, to plug the gap in terms of supplies for oil and gas should have come naturally to a country like Nigeria. But we're not able to take advantage of that, are we?
Well, let's just put it this way. First of all, traditionally, Europe has not been our focus, primarily because they've also not shown significant interest. Most of our gas goes to the Far East, so we're talking about Japan, we're talking about Korea, and with those countries, in a number of them, we have 30-year deals, so that which had been signed in on at the point of commencement. So what we are having is a turnaround. In point of fact, I'm aware that the commissioner, the ambassador for the EU, as well as the ambassador of 3 of the EU nations, met with the Minister of State for Petroleum. Obviously, the discussions was around gas, and since the invasion, they also met with the GMD of NNPC. So there is interest. You also realize that from the Moroccan end, in terms of the Trans-Saharan gas pipeline, Morocco has been able to get funds from the equivalent of the Arab banks for development, as well as from the OPEC fund, and they want to start developing the pipeline from their end. So those are interests. But like I said, the supply chain process for gas requires infrastructure. It's not like regular purchases, and that is going to take a while. So basically, the truth be told is that even if the invasion ends today, the relationship between Europe and Russia is not going to go back to the same as it was pre-invasion. So definitely Europe will continue to put in efforts to look at other sources, other places that are going to supply them gas. And the truth be told, This invasion has literally put a stop to all the talk about ending oil and the renewable thing. In point of fact, the EU has approved certain nations to begin to discuss coal, which is even more pollutant to the atmosphere than gas. And I'm aware that they have spoken to the government of Botswana to get coal for them. So trust me, we are in a situation where as long as we continue to do the right things and put in the proper amount of pressure to develop the infrastructure that we need to do, we will be one of the people that will benefit from supplying gas to Europe and consequently improve our capacity to interact well with Europe among the Committee of Nations.
One can only hope that those who are in charge of putting together the necessary investment and infrastructure are listening to you as you speak this morning. Olabode Olaomi, thank you so much for your time and for your perspective on the program.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.